Shocking news rocked the global aircraft leasing industry. Since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, at least 70 aircraft leased by Chinese companies have been forcibly seized by Russia under the guise of counter-sanctions. Many Chinese firms have suffered losses amounting to billions of yuan. For example, Sunward, a state-owned enterprise in Guangzhou, had 3 planes leased to Russia that could not be reclaimed for years. However, they eventually received compensation from the insurance company. On August 11th, Sunward announced that its subsidiary, AV Max, had signed 3 leasing contracts with Russian clients for 3 planes. These planes have been unable to be recovered since February 2022. After several failed attempts to negotiate and retrieve the planes, AV Max finally reached an agreement with the insurer, receiving a payout of $29 million. After deducting related costs, the net compensation amounted to nearly $23 million, or approximately 160 million yuan. This payout is equivalent to 173% of Sunward's net profit from last year, which has given a significant boost to their financial report. Interestingly, the insurance company leading the coverage for the Chinese planes is Liberty Mutual, an American company. Founded in 1912, Liberty Mutual is the 3rd largest property and casualty insurance company in the U.S. It is headquartered in Boston and ranks 87th in the Fortune 500 based on 2023 revenue, with over 50,000 employees worldwide. In other words, this is a large, reputable insurance company. Sunward's case of receiving compensation from an American insurer has become a focal point in the industry due to the dramatic turnaround and substantial payout. Looking back to February 2022, Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, officially beginning the Russia-Ukraine war. Europe was soon engulfed in conflict. As the aggressor, Russia quickly faced international sanctions, with Russian banks and businesses being restricted from using the global financial system. Russian assets abroad were frozen, including those in the civil aviation sector. The 2 major Western aircraft manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus, stopped supplying aircraft and parts to Russia. Without a steady supply of parts, any malfunctioning aircraft would likely be left unrepairable, preventing normal operation. Consequently, the civil aviation authorities of Ireland and Bermuda canceled the airworthiness certificates of over 700 Russian commercial aircraft. In response, Russia took matters into its own hands, seizing over 500 commercial aircraft from European and other foreign leasing companies still in Russian territory. President Putin signed a decree allowing Russian airlines to re-register leased foreign planes and receive temporary airworthiness certificates within the country. Russia's forced seizure caught global aircraft leasing companies off guard. This decree immediately severed the legal contractual relationships between international leasing companies and their Russian clients. In China, the situation was equally dire. Sunward lost 3 DHC-8 planes, Nippon Precision lost 6 Boeing 757 cargo planes, and Bank of China Aviation Leasing lost 17 passenger planes. In total, over 70 planes leased by Chinese companies to Russia could not be reclaimed. The financial losses for the involved Chinese companies amounted to hundreds of billions of yuan. At this point, airplanes, which are high-value assets, had become strategic assets in Russia, not easily relinquished. Even the Russian government encouraged domestic companies to act unscrupulously, giving Russian airlines a stronger sense of confidence. Looking at the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia's seizure of Chinese leased planes underscores the complexity and fragility of Sino-Russian relations. According to the Chinese Civil Aviation Science and Technology Research Institute, Chinese leasing companies that leased planes to Russia include Bank of China Leasing, China National Leasing, Industrial and Commercial Bank Leasing, Bohai Leasing's Avalon, Henan Aviation Investment, and the joint venture with a Lithuanian leasing company, Avia AM. Upon verification that the aforementioned companies were all state-owned or partially state-owned enterprises. Sunward's subsidiary AV Max had 3 planes leased to Russian clients. According to the contract, the planes should have been regularly maintained and returned on time, but the changing situation rendered the contract obsolete. The planes were still flying, but no longer under the control of the leasing company. Now, these 3 planes continue to fly within Russia, bearing new numbers and performing new flight missions. Each plane at AV Max had financing contracts, insurance agreements, and cross-border legal terms. Based on these, AV Max embarked on a long and difficult journey to reclaim the planes, starting with lawyer letters, followed by negotiations, with piles of documents but no progress. For those in the industry, this situation is not just a simple case of seizure, it's a tangled mess of legal, political, and commercial interests. The experience of Zhejiang Nippon Precision is a true reflection of the industry's struggles. The company leased 6 Boeing 757 planes to Russian clients, but it could only recover 1. In October 2022, the company wrote down an impairment loss of 740 million yuan for the 5 planes that were never returned, and is now pursuing a claim through legal channels, using the insurance company QBE. In September 2022, a Russian client replied coldly, stating, "Due to government policy, returning the planes is virtually impossible." Shenzhen's China Development Bank Leasing terminated leasing contracts for 15 planes with Russian airlines, successfully claiming 6, but 9 planes remained stuck in Russia, with an impairment loss of 2.4 billion yuan confirmed. China Aircraft Leasing also had 2 planes stuck in Russia, resulting in a full impairment loss of 440 million Hong Kong dollars in 2022. Industry leaders faced even more severe asset losses. Bohai Leasing's global second-largest aircraft leasing company, Avalon, had 10 planes in Russia, which led to an impairment loss of $298 million. Bank of China subsidiary, Bank of China Aviation, had 17 planes trapped in Russia, with a full impairment of $800 million. It's worth mentioning that many Chinese companies not only sent legal letters to Russia, but also dispatched teams to negotiate, and even tried to physically take the planes back from airports, all of which have failed. These planes were then put on domestic routes by Russian airlines, with some even disassembled for spare parts to counter the Western supply chain crisis. In short, other Chinese aircraft leasing companies were not as lucky as Sunward. 3 years have passed, and most companies haven't received a single cent of compensation. Some of the seized planes, due to prolonged lack of original manufacturer maintenance and repairs with non-certified parts, have long since lost their airworthiness. Professional evaluations suggest that these planes' residual value may be less than 30% of their book value, meaning that even if reclaimed, they're almost worthless. Russia has used the insurance payouts from Chinese companies to subsidize its airlines for continuing to seize other planes, making it the ultimate empty-handed gamble operation. According to recent reports from mainland China, as of August 2025, over 50 Chinese planes remain stuck in Russia. Their fate depends on 3 major factors. Firstly, the direction of the Russia-Ukraine war. If the conflict becomes prolonged, the possibility of reclaiming the planes will decrease further. Secondly, adjustments in international sanctions. If the West eases sanctions on Russian aviation, it could create a window for asset disposal. Lastly, the evolution of Sino-Russian relations. Deepening bilateral economic and trade cooperation could provide a diplomatic channel for resolving the dispute. From a legal perspective, this is an unconventional tactic that breaks the usual understanding in the international civil aviation sector. For decades, the aircraft leasing industry has relied on multinational contracts and regulatory frameworks, and this incident has pierced a hole in that system. On an international scale, the losses are staggering. Statistics show that over 500 leased aircraft are stuck in Russia, involving funds in the tens of billions of US dollars. Insurance companies and leasing firms are adjusting their strategies, with some directly writing off assets in their financial reports, while others have withdrawn from the market. Why did Russia seize so many planes? Most of the aircraft used by Russian civil aviation are leased, with only a small number owned outright. Without these leased planes, Russian air transport would struggle to continue, especially in the vast, sparsely populated regions where the lack of planes could bring the entire system to a halt. However, Russia's seizure of Chinese aircraft has sparked anger among many Chinese netizens. Some Chinese netizens argue that while Western countries have continuously expanded sanctions against Russia, China has not sanctioned Russia in return. China has not frozen Russian assets and has even increased bilateral trade cooperation. Since 2022, trade between China and Russia has steadily grown, reaching over $240 billion in 2023. In recent years, Putin has visited Beijing multiple times, emphasizing the flourishing strategic relationship between the two countries. Based on this, they believe Russia has no legitimate reason to include Chinese aircraft in its counter-sanctions. From a reasonable standpoint, the official narrative that Sino-Russian relations are close and that cooperation is limitless has failed to provide Chinese companies with tangible protection. Russia has placed Chinese companies in the same predicament as Western firms, and this one-size-fits-all approach is baffling. Netizens argue that Russia has no legitimate reason to seize Chinese companies' planes. The situation worsened when Russia established a special committee to strictly control the process of returning seized aircraft. The committee stipulated that any Russian airline wishing to return aircraft to their country of ownership must follow a lengthy approval process. Russia even encouraged its own companies to default on their obligations. This has put Chinese companies in a difficult position. They cannot effectively pursue compensation through diplomatic channels and can't seek justice through the Russian legal system. In contrast, Western companies, while facing large losses, have a clear legal and political framework to support the recovery efforts. Chinese companies are left in a no-win situation. They cannot openly oppose Russia to maintain bilateral relations, yet they cannot rely on the power of the state to resolve this issue quickly. As Professor Wang Yiwei from the School of International Relations at Renmin University of China pointed out, many Chinese companies still have painful memories from their dealings with Russian partners. Professor Wang explained in an interview, Chinese companies have traditionally maintained limited economic cooperation with Russia and prefer working with Western market economies that have established legal systems. Russia's economic mindset is drastically different from market economy principles. In fact, it's not only Chinese aircraft leasing companies that have fallen victim to Russia's pirate logic. In recent years, Chinese assets have been seized by Russia under questionable charges on several occasions. After Western countries imposed comprehensive sanctions on Russia, China's trucks and the China-Europe Railway Express became crucial lifelines for Russia's logistics and transportation. In fact, a major reason why Russia has been able to continue its war for 3 years is due to the significant indirect support it has received from the Chinese government. This has allowed Russia to maintain its war efforts. However, recently, Russia made a dramatic turn and took aggressive actions against China. On July 30th, China's Federal Technical Supervision and Metrology Agency suddenly announced a ban on the import and sale of trucks from 4 of China's major brands. The reason given was safety threats, with issues such as inadequate braking performance, excessive noise, defective seatbelt installations, and failure to meet emission standards. Sitrac, which holds a 14.2% share of the Russian truck market, was specifically mentioned. Dongfeng, Jiefeng, and Foton together hold an additional 13.5%, meaning these 4 Chinese companies dominate nearly 30% of the Russian market. More crucially, the ban covers all models used in logistics transportation, directly severing the lifeline of Chinese heavy-duty trucks in Russia. Russia has already set up an extensive web of restrictions. Scrap taxes have surged to about $7,800, equivalent to 30% of the price of a Chinese truck. Parallel import channels have been completely blocked, with the Central Asia transit route share plummeting from 30% to just 2%. A mandatory OTTC certification now requires all testing to be completed within Russia, doubling costs and extending the process to a year. Tens of thousands of new trucks in transit are facing destruction. On the surface, the ban on Chinese trucks appears to be a technical compliance issue, but in reality, it is a mix of trade protectionism and geopolitical maneuvering. Not only trucks have been affected, but the China-Europe Railway Express has also run into problems. Since last October, Russian customs has been scrutinizing containers on the trains. Russia issued a ban specifically targeting containers, particularly those containing dual-use items, such as machinery and electronics, which could potentially be used by Western forces stationed in Ukraine. In other words, anything related to the military, once it enters Russian territory, gets confiscated. Since then, Russia has periodically conducted extensive inspections on goods being shipped from China to Europe. As a result, thousands of containers on this vast rail route from China to Europe have been seized by Russian authorities. Approximately 80,000 20-foot equivalent containers are detained every month. Even ordinary items like men's jackets and Christmas products have not been spared. For example, 70 containers from the Hunan Badatong Logistics Company were seized, leaving the company in a state of urgent distress. By 2025, Russia's methods of seizing goods became stricter, and the number of Chinese goods being held continued to grow. Many companies missed key sales seasons, incurring heavy losses. According to freight forwarders, at least 1,000 containers were seized at that time, with some of the seized goods later confiscated by Russian authorities without following legal procedures. This led to a significant decline in the total cargo volume of the China-Europe Railway Express. According to data from China Railway Container Transport Company, container cargo volumes to Europe decreased by 20% in the first half of this year compared to last year. However, in the face of Chinese companies' losses, the Chinese government has been powerless, remaining silent. When facing Western media or U.S. sanctions, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs often often responds with strong condemnation through wolf warrior-style statements, such as criticizing the U.S. crackdown on Huawei. The Ministry of Commerce has also shown a firm stance, like its 2023 antitrust investigation into NVIDIA. Yet, in the case of Russia seizing over 70 Chinese leased planes, the Chinese government has kept a low profile, never openly condemning Russia. What confuses netizens is why the Chinese government, which has been so aggressive in responding to Western sanctions, seems so weak when it comes to Russia. This situation reveals a harsh reality. When Russia faces survival pressures, even assets belonging to friendly countries are not exempt. Ironically, Chinese companies have not received substantial help from either the Russian side or the Chinese government. For example, in the case of Sunward, the company had to rely on an American insurance company to recover its losses. The ultimate takeaway from this incident is that relying on the Chinese government is less reliable than relying on an American insurance company. No wonder some Chinese netizens sarcastically said on X that dealing with rogue states requires an even bigger rogue state. What do you think? Feel free to leave your comments and discuss.